In the midst of a war that raged across the civilized world, when the skies themselves became battlegrounds and cities burned beneath falling bombs, a group of British schoolboys found themselves cast away upon a deserted island in the Pacific, torn from the safety of their ordered lives and thrust into a pristine wilderness that would become, in time, something far more savage than any battlefield they had left behind. The island rose from the sea like a sleeping beast, its mountain peaks shrouded in perpetual mist, its beaches fringed with palm trees that swayed in the tropical breeze. Coral reefs encircled it in a protective embrace, their shallow waters glowing turquoise in the brilliant sunlight, while beyond them the open ocean stretched away in all directions, endless and indifferent. It was a place of extraordinary beauty, a paradise, one might have thought, where coconuts hung heavy on the trees and fruit grew wild in the jungle, where clear streams ran down from the mountain and the warm sand invited barefoot wandering. But paradise, as the boys would learn, depends less on the landscape than on the souls of those who inhabit it. The plane had been shot down, the adults killed or scattered, and the surviving boys, perhaps 24 in all, ranging in age from 6 to 13, found themselves alone, without supervision, without structure, without any of the civilizing constraints that had governed their young lives. At first, this freedom seemed intoxicating, a grand adventure straight from the pages of the adventure stories they had read. They could do as they pleased, answer to no one, make their own rules. The adult world, with all its restrictions and demands, had vanished, leaving them masters of their own fate. Among the survivors emerged 2 boys who would come to embody opposing visions of what their island society might become. The first was Ralph, a fair-haired boy of 12, athletic and appealing, with a natural authority that made others want to follow him. He possessed a certain innocence still, a belief in the power of reason and order, a faith that if they simply maintained their civilization, kept a signal fire burning, built shelters, organized themselves properly, they would surely be rescued and returned to the world they had known. The second was Jack Meridew, leader of a choir group that had survived intact, a boy with red hair and freckles and a fierce hunger for dominance that had, until now, been channeled into the acceptable hierarchies of school and church. In Jack burned something primitive and wild, barely contained by the thin veneer of choir-boy discipline, and the island would provide the stage for that wildness to emerge in all its terrible glory. Their first act as a community was to establish order. Ralph found a conch shell on the beach, a beautiful thing, cream and rose-colored, its spiraled chambers holding the sound of the sea. When he blew into it, the deep, resonant note carried across the island, summoning the scattered survivors to the beach. The conch became their symbol of authority, their artifact of democracy. Whoever held it had the right to speak, while the others were obliged to listen. They elected Ralph as their chief, though Jack clearly hungered for the position. Ralph's victory was narrow, secured partly by his possession of the conch and partly by the support of a fat, asthmatic boy whom the others had taken to calling Piggy, a cruel nickname that the boy bore with patient resignation. Piggy was intelligent, thoughtful, and sensible, but his physical weaknesses and lower-class accent made him an object of derision among the other boys. He wore thick glasses, spectacles that would become crucial to their survival, for their lenses could focus the sun's rays and create fire. Ralph's first act as chief was to organize an exploration of the island. He took Jack and a quiet boy, named Simon, with him, climbing the mountain to survey their domain. From the summit, they could see that they were indeed on an island surrounded entirely by water, with no sign of other land or human habitation. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. They were truly alone, truly free, but also truly isolated from any hope of immediate rescue. The boys established rules and responsibilities. They would maintain a signal fire on the mountain, its smoke visible to any passing ships. They would build shelters on the beach. They would organize themselves, maintain order, and behave as civilized British boys should behave until the inevitable rescue came. Ralph, with Piggy's prompting, articulated these sensible plans, and the boys agreed enthusiastically, caught up in the adventure and the novelty of self-governance. But even in those early days, cracks began to appear in their fragile civilization. Jack became obsessed with hunting the wild pigs that roamed the island. At first, this seemed a practical concern. They needed meat, after all. But there was something in Jack's pursuit of the pigs that went beyond mere sustenance. He spent hours crafting spears, painting his face with colored clay, leading his choir boys, now transformed into hunters, through the jungle in pursuit of prey. The hunt became ritual, became obsession, became a way of expressing something dark and primal that civilization had always suppressed, but never truly eliminated. The signal fire was neglected. The shelters went unbuilt, as most of the boys preferred to play in the lagoon rather than engage in the tedious work of construction. Only Ralph and Simon labored on the shelters, and even they could manage only crude lean-tos that barely kept out the rain. The comfortable certainty of their first days began to erode, replaced by a growing awareness that maintaining civilization required constant effort, constant vigilance, and that many of the boys were unwilling or unable to provide either. Piggy remained Ralph's most loyal supporter and closest advisor, though Ralph sometimes treated him with casual cruelty, embarrassed by the association with someone so obviously weak and vulnerable. Piggy understood things the others didn't, understood that the fire was more important than hunting, that building shelters mattered more than playing, that without rules and responsibilities, their society would collapse into chaos. But Piggy lacked the physical prowess and social standing to make others listen, and so his wisdom was often ignored or dismissed. Simon was different from the other boys. Quiet, mystical, given to wandering alone through the jungle to a hidden grove where he could sit in peaceful solitude. He was kind to the younger boys, the little uns, who cried at night and spoke of beasts lurking in the darkness. Simon possessed an almost supernatural sensitivity, an ability to perceive truths that others missed, though he struggled to articulate these perceptions in ways the others could understand. And the little uns, those small boys who had lost everything familiar, who were now cast adrift in a world too large and frightening for their young minds to comprehend, they began to have nightmares. They spoke of a beast that lived on the island, a creature that emerged at night to hunt them, a monster that grew larger and more terrible with each retelling. The older boys dismissed these fears as childish fancy, But the beast, once imagined, took on a life of its own in the collective psyche of the stranded children. The turning point came one day when a ship passed in the distance, its smoke visible on the horizon. Ralph raced to the mountaintop to check the signal fire, his heart pounding with hope, only to find the fire dead, reduced to cold ashes. Jack and his hunters had abandoned their responsibility to maintain it, had gone off on a hunt instead, had actually succeeded in killing a pig, and were now celebrating their triumph with savage joy, their faces painted, their spears stained with blood. Ralph's fury was terrible to behold. They had missed their chance at rescue, had allowed the ship to pass because Jack had prioritized hunting over their salvation. The confrontation between Ralph and Jack marked the beginning of open warfare between the two. Between Ralph's vision of maintained civilization and Jack's embrace of primitive savagery. Jack's response was defiant. We needed meat. He spoke with the blood of the pig still on his hands, his eyes bright with the thrill of the kill, and many of the boys looked at him with admiration, attracted to his strength and his freedom from the constraints of civilized behavior. The feast that followed was a moment of terrible significance. The boys gorged on roasted pig, the meat torn and shared with primitive enthusiasm, and Jack presided over the meal like some tribal chieftain. His authority derived not from democratic election, but from the power to provide and to kill. Ralph and Piggy attended the feast, unable to resist the temptation of meat after weeks of fruit and nuts. And in doing so, they implicitly acknowledged Jack's growing power. The beast became more real with each passing day. The Litlands' nightmares grew worse, and their fears infected even the older boys. Some claimed to have seen it. A dark shape moving through the trees, a creature that walked upright but was not human. The island, which had seemed a paradise, now felt hostile and threatening, as though it harbored some malevolent presence that wished them harm. One night, during a battle high in the sky, distant echoes of the war that still raged in the civilized world, a dead parachutist drifted down to the island, landing on the mountain near their signal fire. The corpse, suspended in its parachute harness, moved with the wind, its shape grotesque and inhuman in the darkness. Two boys, sent to tend the fire, caught a glimpse of this figure and fled in terror, convinced they had seen the beast. The news spread through the camp like wildfire. The beast was real. It lived on the mountain. No one was safe. Jack seized this opportunity with cunning instinct. He proposed a hunt to kill the beast, to prove their courage and make the island safe. Ralph, still clinging to rationality, tried to convince the others that there was no beast, that their fears were imaginary. But his words fell on deaf ears. The boys wanted to believe in the beast because the beast gave shape to their nameless fears, provided an external enemy to blame for their growing unhappiness. Simon, alone among them, began to suspect the truth, that the beast was not some external creature, but something internal, something that lived within each of them, the capacity for savagery, for cruelty, for evil that civilization had always held at bay, but which their isolation had set free. He tried to articulate this insight during one of their assemblies, speaking hesitantly about the beast being part of themselves, but the others mocked him or failed to understand. Jack dismissed such talk as cowardice and stupidity, while Ralph, though more thoughtful, could not quite grasp what Simon was trying to say. The split came inevitably. Jack, frustrated by Ralph's emphasis on the fire and rescue, openly challenged his authority. When Ralph retained the loyalty of most of the boys, Jack stormed off, declaring that he would form his own tribe, that those who wanted to hunt and have fun should follow him. At first, only a few choir boys went with him, but Jack had learned the power of temptation. He and his hunters killed another pig, and he invited all the boys to a feast at his camp at the far end of the island. The feast was more than a meal. It was a ceremony, a dark ritual that bound those who participated to Jack's tribe. They painted their faces with clay and charcoal, transforming themselves into anonymous savages. They chanted and danced around the fire, their movements primitive and hypnotic, and Jack presided over it all with growing confidence. His authority derived not from any democratic process, but from pure, naked power. Even Ralph and Piggy were drawn to the feast, unable to resist the lure of meat and community. As they ate, as the dancing grew more frenzied, storm clouds gathered overhead, and lightning split the sky. The wind rose, and the atmosphere grew charged with electricity and primitive emotion. It was then that Simon emerged from the jungle, staggering with exhaustion and revelation. He had climbed the mountain alone, had confronted the beast, and had discovered the truth. The beast was merely a dead man, a parachutist whose corpse moved with the wind. There was nothing to fear except their own capacity for fear itself. But Simon, stumbling into the circle of dancers in the darkness and the storm, was mistaken for the beast. The boys, caught up in their savage ritual, fell upon him with spears, teeth, and nails, tearing at him in a frenzy of violence and terror. They killed him there on the beach, this gentle, mystical boy who had come to bring them truth, and his blood stained the sand while the storm raged overhead and the waves washed his body out to sea. The morning after Simon's murder brought a terrible reckoning. Ralph and Piggy tried to convince themselves it had been an accident, that the darkness and the storm had confused everyone, that they hadn't really participated in the killing. But the lie tasted bitter in their mouths, and the guilt weighed heavily upon them. Jack's tribe, by contrast, felt no such remorse. They had killed the beast, Jack told them, and now they were safe. The killing had bound them together, had crossed some invisible threshold beyond which there was no return to civilized behavior. They had become, in truth, the savages they had been playing at being. Jack's tribe grew as more boys defected from Ralph's dwindling group. They stole fire from Ralph's camp, and in the chaos of the raid, they stole something far more precious, Piggy's glasses, the only means of creating fire on the island. Without the glasses, Ralph's group was left powerless, unable even to send smoke signals for rescue. Ralph, now reduced to just 4 loyal followers, including Piggy, confronted Jack's tribe at their fortress on Castle Rock, a rocky outcrop that they had claimed and fortified. Ralph demanded the return of the glasses, appealed to reason and fairness and the rules they had all agreed to follow. But such appeals meant nothing to boys who had tasted blood and power, who had painted their faces and danced their savage dances, who had crossed the line from civilization to barbarism and found they preferred the other side. The confrontation ended in tragedy. Roger, one of Jack's most sadistic followers, released a boulder that had been positioned above the narrow approach to Castle Rock. The boulder struck Piggy, killing him instantly and shattering the conch shell he had been holding. Piggy's body was thrown 40 feet down to the rocks below, and the conch, that symbol of democracy and civilized discourse, was destroyed, its fragments scattered across the stone. Ralph fled for his life, hunted through the jungle by Jack's tribe, who had now embraced their savagery completely and sought to kill the last representative of the civilization they had rejected. The final hunt was a nightmare of pursuit and terror. Jack's tribe set the entire forest ablaze to drive Ralph from hiding, willing to destroy their island home in their determination to kill him. Ralph ran through the smoke and flames, exhausted and desperate, falling and rising and falling again, while behind him came the hunters with their painted faces and sharpened spears, baying for his blood like a pack of hounds. He burst from the jungle onto the beach and fell at the feet of a naval officer who had seen the smoke and brought his ship to investigate. The officer stood there in his crisp white uniform, representing the ordered world of adults, of civilization, of rescue. Behind him, his ship waited at anchor, and beyond that, the war still raged, the adult world engaged in its own savage struggle, proving that the beast Simon had identified was not confined to children on an island, but lived in the hearts of all humanity. The other boys emerged from the jungle, still carrying their spears, their painted faces now looking foolish and childish in the presence of adult authority. They stood there on the beach, suddenly aware of what they had become, of what they had done, of the innocence they had lost forever. Ralph wept for the end of innocence, for the darkness of man's heart, and for the fall through the air of Piggy, wise and true friend. The officer, uncomfortable with such emotion, looked away, waiting for the boys to regain control of themselves so they could be taken aboard ship and return to the civilization they had tried so hard to recreate and had failed so utterly to maintain. The island stood empty once more, the fires burning themselves out, the jungle slowly reclaiming the clearings where the boys had built their shelters and their fortresses. The beast, that creature of imagination and fear, had never existed, and yet it had been terribly real, manifesting not as any external monster, but as the savage potential that lived within the boys themselves, waiting only for the removal of civilizing constraints to emerge in all its horrifying power. What had happened on that island was not an aberration, but a revelation. Given freedom from adult supervision, given the removal of rules and consequences, given the struggle for power and resources in a world without law, the boys had descended into savagery with terrifying speed. The veneer of civilization had proved impossibly thin, and beneath it lurked something ancient and dark, something that all the schools and churches and proper British upbringing could not quite eliminate. Some of the boys, like Ralph and Piggy and Simon, had tried to maintain that civilization, had clung to rules and reason and basic human decency. But they had been outnumbered and overpowered by those who embraced the freedom to indulge their worst impulses, who found liberation in abandoning morality and embracing the law of the jungle. The question that haunted those who survived, that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, was this: what did their experience reveal about human nature? Were they simply children who had behaved badly in extraordinary circumstances? Or had they demonstrated some fundamental truth about what humans become when the constraints of society are removed? In the years that followed, those boys would return to England, would grow into men, would live lives shaped forever by their time on the island. They would carry with them the memory of what they had done, what they had witnessed, what they had become. Some would deny it, would convince themselves it had been different than it was, would rewrite their own histories to make themselves less culpable. Others would be haunted by nightmares of painted faces and sharpened spears, of Simon's murder and Piggy's death, of the terrible ease with which they had abandoned everything they had been taught about right and wrong. Ralph would remember the weight of leadership, the impossible burden of trying to maintain civilization when others wanted only to indulge their savage impulses. He would remember Piggy's loyalty and Simon's strange wisdom, and he would grieve for them in ways that the officer on that beach could never understand. Jack and his hunters would carry different memories, perhaps of power and freedom, perhaps of guilt and shame, perhaps simply of a time when they were allowed to be what they truly were beneath the masks of civilization. Whether they would see their experience as liberation or as fall from grace would depend on what they chose to believe about the nature of humanity itself. The island remained in the Pacific, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded on its shores. The palm trees still swayed in the breeze, the fruit still grew wild, the mountain still rose into the mist. It was paradise still, or could be, for visitors who came with different hearts and different intentions. The island itself was innocent. It was only the boys who had made it savage, who had transformed paradise into hell through the darkness they carried within themselves. William Golding, who had witnessed the horrors of the Second World War, who had seen what supposedly civilized nations could do to one another, wrote this tale as an answer to all those optimistic stories about children having grand adventures on desert islands. He knew better. He had seen what humans were capable of when the restraints came off, when power went unchecked, when fear and tribalism overcame reason and compassion. The beast, he wanted us to understand, is always with us. It lives not in the jungle or the darkness, but in the human heart, waiting for its moment to emerge. Civilization is not the natural state of humanity, but rather a fragile construct, maintained only through constant effort and eternal vigilance. Remove that effort, remove those constraints, and we revert with terrifying speed to something older, something darker, something that has lived within us since the dawn of human consciousness. But Golding also showed us that not all succumb equally to this darkness. Ralph and Piggy and Simon tried to resist, tried to maintain their humanity even when surrounded by savagery. They failed, or two of them died trying, but their attempt mattered. Their resistance to the darkness, however futile it proved in the end, demonstrated that humans possess the capacity for both savagery and civilization, that we are not doomed to descend into barbarism, but rather face a constant choice about which path we will follow. The conch shell may have shattered, but the idea it represented, that we can govern ourselves through reason and democratic discourse rather than through violence and fear, that idea survives. It survives in every society that chooses law over chaos, in every individual who chooses compassion over cruelty, in every moment when we consciously reject the savage impulse in favor of our better nature. And so we come to the end of this dark tale, this exploration of what lies beneath the surface of civilization, this meditation on innocence lost and lessons learned at terrible cost. The boys were rescued, but they could never return to who they had been before the island. They had seen too much, done too much, learned too much about the darkness that lives in human hearts. We who hear their story are left to wonder, what would we have done in their place? Would we have stood with Ralph, trying desperately to maintain order and reason? Would we have joined Jack, embracing the freedom and power of savagery? Would we have been like Simon, perceiving truth but unable to make others understand? Or would we have been like the little uns, simply trying to survive in a world that had become too frightening to comprehend? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. The beast that haunted that island haunts our world as well, in our politics, in our conflicts, in every moment when we must choose between our civilized values and our savage impulses. The island was a microcosm of the larger world, and the boys' struggle reflects the eternal human struggle between the forces of order and chaos, reason and emotion, civilization and barbarism. The fire on the mountain has gone out. The smoke that might have signaled rescue has dissipated into the tropical air, and the island stands silent once more beneath the indifferent stars. But the story endures, passed down through generations. A warning and a challenge to all who hear it. We are all capable of both great good and terrible evil, and the choice between them is ours to make every day in ways large and small. The beast is real, Simon tried to tell them. The beast is us. And until we acknowledge that truth, until we recognize the darkness within ourselves and consciously choose to resist it, we will continue to create islands of savagery wherever we go, transforming paradise into hell through the darkness we carry in our own hearts. The conch lies shattered on the rocks. Piggy is dead. Simon is dead. The hunters have become savages. But Ralph still weeps, and in those tears lies the possibility of redemption, the recognition of what has been lost, the grief for innocence destroyed, the acknowledgement that we have failed but might somehow learn to do better. This is the legacy of the island, the lesson purchased at such terrible cost. That civilization is precious precisely because it is fragile, that humanity is always just a few steps away from savagery, and that our hope lies not in denying the beast, but in recognizing it, confronting it, and choosing day after day, moment after moment, to be something better than what our worst impulses would make us. The night is deep, the stars burn cold above, and somewhere in the Pacific an island waits, beautiful and terrible, innocent and damned, paradise and hell in one, reflecting back to us the truth about ourselves that we would often rather not see. The beast is real. The beast is us. And the only question that remains is what we will do with that knowledge.